Welcome to our first online event concerning treated timber. Thank you all for joining. I think there are more people coming in, but we did say 12 o'clock, so we will start now. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very pleased. This is the first joint event between the TTF, the TDCA and the WPA on timber treatment and our campaign around treated timber. I think everyone on this call will know that we've been working together, particularly TTF and WPA, on this subject and running this campaign now for some time. And this is a campaign that will be running through the course of this year and next. We've also got support within this and for this campaign from CON4 and other organisations to really sort of start to get the message out about getting the treatment right. And so we thought it was only appropriate that we ran this event today to say, let's talk treated timber. I thought I'd just take at the start of this presentation, really just a couple of minutes to talk through, well, why are we doing this and where did this come from? And I think in terms of why are we doing this, I think this is a continuation of a number of themes that have run through Timber Trade Federation and WPA work for some time about using the right product in the right place, making sure that the wrong product does not go into a project and start to cause problems with specification. We really started talking about this in the NSD about 2 years ago in the National Softwood Division of the TTF, about saying, well, are people selling the right thing? What are merchants doing and what are members doing about labelling the goods properly, making sure that the product descriptions are being carried all the way through the supply chain, from the treatment plant through to merchants, through to builders, through to architects and others, and really trying to make sure that that was happening. So that was one impetus behind it. Secondly, in discussion with WPA, they were also concerned that perhaps there was a lot of product out there which either hadn't been treated to the right specification or to the right cycle, and that there was a real problem in terms of members labeling and marking their goods as being what they were and clearly identifying them so that their customers knew what they were getting. And of course, as this slide is saying, that we wanted to address the knowledge gap that existed within the market. We looked into that. We looked at conducting surveys on behalf of TTF and WPA. We did a mystery shopper style research and found really that merchants, end users, their understanding of preservative treated timber was very poor. That within the merchant sector itself, of those surveyed, 97% of merchants, and it was really 97% of the staff that we were interviewing, did not know that you needed a specific use class of timber for timber in ground contact. And there was only 3% amongst them that knew that that should have been use class 4. Over 90% said they didn't know there was any specific treatment. 72% said they had no idea what use class 4 even meant. So there is a big problem. And I think that now more than ever, this is a very important point to get right. There's a number of reasons. One, we're seeing negative feedback coming in from certain quarters of your end use sector organizations in fencing and landscaping and other markets. And also as we come through into looking at other regulatory issues which are going to affect all of our members and the whole market in which you operate. There is a code for construction product information coming out, which will be coming into force this summer. There's a consultation open on this until the 31st of March, and we would urge all of our members to respond. There is a full page of information about this on the TTF website. You should have received an email detailing what the code for construction product information outlines, and you can read through that. You can read through all the information we've prepared, and also then responds to the questionnaire, the consultation that exists from online. Really, we should all be supporting this Code for Construction Product Information, and this campaign I see as part of that, along with other elements of programs that we're running within the TTF, whether it's on Chinese plywood, treated timber, or whatever. The principles are the same, and they're the same that runs through the Code for Construction Product Information, and they're the same that run through our Code of Conduct within the TTF. And put very simply, what the Code for Construction Product Information asks all of those involved in marketing, sales, distribution, installation of construction products is to make sure that the information that you provide to your buyer, whether that buyer is an end user or an intermediary, that there is an unbroken chain of information passing all the way through that is clear, unambiguous, accurate, up to date, and accessible. And this is a very key point, so that any competent individual, and there is a whole ream of work around this idea of competence within organizations, within organizations that are selling or trading in construction products. But the information has to be accessible so that any competent individual that is working with or installing these products can understand how and where to use them and the limitations that they have around their products. Now, this whole world, if you like, this whole framework is one of the many outcomes that has come from the fallout from the Grenfell fire, the Grenfell tragedy from several years ago. From our own point of view, we know that the timber sector has several Achilles heels, fire being one in people's minds and the perception of timber, but also this idea of quality and product failure and all the rest of it. And often those failures are not to do with timber, they're not to do with the inherent properties of timber itself. It's simply buying the wrong product for the purposes and putting the wrong product into projects, into installations. We think, quite rightly, this is a good chance, this Code for Construction Product Information, to get our own house in order and to prove that TTF members are at the forefront of business ethics, that our members are providing accurate, accessible information to their customers and really living up to the Timber You Can Trust campaign that we will be pushing out much more strongly again on the back of this campaign, the plywood and other campaigns that we're going to be running. I think it's absolutely vital that we take this into account. Treated timber is one of the probably the biggest categories that are of products that you will be selling and that merchants will be selling in terms of solid wood. We don't want that to be jeopardized. We don't want that to be got wrong. So what we hope to do today, and I will be passing over to Nick and to Gordon, is to talk through the TTF members' action plan that we've drawn up, that you've all been signatory to and part of developing, how that is working, what that is then being expected from yourselves, and how that can work, and how we aim to communicate that out into the market. So I think at that point, I'm going to stop talking, you'll be very pleased to know, and hand over to Nick and Gordon to conduct the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. Good afternoon to everyone. I see we've got about 70 people on the call today, so that's really good. Thanks for your support. I'm going to cover some information on the TTF action plan as a starting point. But just to remind everyone, if you have questions during the presentations, please use the Q&A facility that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can type questions in there and we'll pick them up in that order when we get to the end of the presentation. Once we get to the end of the presentation, if you've got questions, please raise your hand and Chris will make your mic live and we'll take questions like that if we've got the opportunity. Okay, so moving on to the TTF action plan. The surveys that Dave mentioned in the introduction We're really the beginning of the joint WPA, TTF, TDCA treatment project back in 2018. That project identified a number of key areas where work was required. Clearly, as the slide showed, the lack of understanding of the different levels of treatment that were available, inconsistent language and training of staff responsible for selling treated timber, the need for clear guidance on installation, claims of premature failures in fence posts as reported by customers and in the press, and finally a lack of appreciation on the critical difference between process control and product quality. So we developed the TTF Action Plan with assistance from members of the National Softwood Division as the main group providing treated timber to the market. And this became the principal outcome of the project and really gave us a means to, or gives us a means to start addressing some of the issues that have been identified. There are three linked strands to the action plan: communication, education, and accreditation. And these strands were incorporated into the formal TTF Code of Conduct at the AGM back in November. And this commits all members to follow the same route and implement the necessary actions in the same timetable. As Dave said, these commitments also put TTF members ahead of the curve in addressing the Code for Construction Products Information, which is something that we believe will underpin the honesty and credibility of the construction product suppliers into the future. Let's look at these individual strands of work. Point A, which is accurate product descriptions. So this is about communication. So the project itself identified that lots of different terminology and descriptions were being used to identify treated wood products. Many of these were at best vague and at worst deliberately misleading about the level of treatment that was being provided and therefore the end use situation for which the product would be suitable. One critical factor identified was that many of the descriptions concentrated on the process that was being applied rather than the quality of product that resulted from that process. And that's a really critical point. I'll come back to that in a minute. The NSD identified that the British Standard Code of Practice for Timber Treatment, BS 8417, provided succinct terminology that easily identifies the category of treatment and linked this directly to specific end uses in construction and landscaping. This is the use class system, and it was identified that the three critical categories for the majority of most TTF members and their customers are interior use only, use class 2, exterior use above ground, use class 3U, ground contact, use class 4. On this basis, the commitment in point A of the Code of Conduct requires members to identify throughout their paperwork which of these use classes each treated product is being sold as suitable for. The expectation is that the description will appear against each product line on purchasing, stock, and sales documentation. The timetable for implementation of this particular commitment is at the end of this month, so literally next week, 31st of March. Anyone who knows me well will be aware that I also believe marking the use classes on the product is probably going to be the way forward, particularly around use class 4. This is not yet a requirement of the Code of Conduct, but I'm really pleased to say that quite a number of members have already taken on board this commitment and have already moved towards marking on the product as well. So that's good to see. Moving on to training materials. So point B of the Code of Conduct is about education. So the treatment project identified that there was a lot of misunderstanding throughout the supply chain about the role that preservative treatments play in the timber sector and how they need to be correctly specified in order to get the product right for the right job. To address this misunderstanding, TTF, WPA and TDCA have worked together in partnership to produce a range of information and training aids that are specifically designed around the use classes that you are being asked to identify on your paperwork. We believe that this should make it easy to share the information with both your staff and your customers. This information is available through the WPA resources page or by visiting the TTF website in the members area, marketing treated timber, and the links on the screen. There are leaflets for each use class and generic pictorial information which can be used on the sales counter and as a poster in the yard. There is also a training module which will be coming available, which will be online as a download on demand. Obviously, many TTF members are already providing their staff and customers with great educational materials about preservative treatments. The TTF WPA material is intended to supplement that current training. It's not intended to replace it. If there are any other materials that you think will be helpful, then please let us know and we'll look to develop those as well. Moving on to point C, which is about accreditation and auditing. The treatment project identified that there was a significant lack of appreciation on the critical difference between process control and product quality. This is something that the TTF had found previously on the Chinese plywood project. There was an assumption on that amongst Chinese plywood suppliers that if an exterior glue was purchased and the correct press cycle was used, then plywood with an exterior glue bond would automatically result. However, when we introduced independent testing as part of the TTF Code of Conduct, it very quickly became apparent that all was not well and much tighter process controls were required. Here, in terms of timber treatment, we're talking about the penetration and retention levels that are required for the different treated products as defined in BS 8417. In a few minutes, Gordon will give you some more details about the audit process and what is required. But first, it's important to understand why independent accreditation is necessary. Treatment providers will be giving treatment plant operators theoretical process parameters. If you use X species at Y moisture content or below, and then run it through the use class 4 cycle, in theory, it should achieve the necessary penetration and retention as set out in BS 8417. But the critical word here is theoretical. As the manufacturer, you are legally responsible for the products that you are placing on the market. So is theoretical good enough? All treatment providers should be running regular audit checks and laboratory samples to ensure that the theoretical in your circumstances is translating into products that have the right penetration and retention for the job. Where this is regularly being undertaken, companies can have a reasonable level of confidence in the products that they're putting out. However, in order to have greater confidence in our treated products, TTF and WPA believe it's necessary to have independent accreditation of the safe relationship between theoretical process control and actual product quality. Independent accreditation under schemes like Benchmark is not a short-term fix. It's a long-term aim to work as a sector to maintain and improve the quality of treated products being placed on the market. Members should look at starting this audit process immediately, as it will take quite time to get plants registered. So although the end date is June 2022 next year, we would suggest that the sooner people start, the better. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Gordon to give us some more information on treatment specifications.
Thanks, Nick. Can we have the next slide, please? And good afternoon, everybody. So my role in this is to try and explain a little bit more of the detail of what we're saying to the market as part of this campaign. Just to sort of give a specific illustration, Nick and I did a seminar for the Builders Merchant Federation Timber Forum a couple of weeks ago. And some of the material you're going to see we were using as part of that. And also Nick has already referred to training resources. We've developed a downloadable webinar, 18 minutes long. It's fairly snappy and to the point, which any TTF, WPA, TDCA member can use, maybe for your own staff training, maybe for customers, however you feel it would benefit your business. And again, some of the slides that you're going to see are part of that webinar. So I'm hoping that most of the people linked in today realize that it does matter how you specify treated wood, and it's a mistake to assume that all pressure treated timber is the same, even though it might look very similar. Next slide, please, Nick. So the two reference standards that we use in the UK are BS 8417, as Nick has mentioned, but also the WPA have a code of practice for industrial wood preservation. This was republished, updated and reissued in January this year, so it's bang up to date. And again, uses many of the illustrations I'm going to refer to. Next slide, please. So when specifying a preservative treatment, the level of protection required depends on a number of different aspects. The species, its durability and ability to accept treatment, where the component is going to be used, and how long the component needs to perform. Usually working on the system of what we call desired service lives. In the standards, it's either 15, 30 or 60 years, depending on the end use. And the national technical standards I've mentioned consider all of these elements, and they give guidance on the retention of the preservative and the penetration level required to meet each of these criteria. So working in tandem with BS EN 335, WPA Code of Practice and 8417 group treated timber products into, well, there are actually 5 use classes, but we're talking about 3 here because these are the ones that are most common and certainly the ones that are most commercially significant. So we have use class 2, above the ground or a damp-proof course, but within the envelope of the building. So that would include things like tile battens, timber framing, joists, sole plates, and so on. Use class 3, well, then we move to exterior applications. Use class 3U, the U stands for uncoated, and there we're looking at deck boards, fence rails and boards, cladding, including the battens for cladding and fascias. And then use class 4 is for ground contact and freshwater contact as well. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So I'll move on from there. So next slide, please. Yeah, I just want to say something about deck substructures. And the reason for this is that the specification has changed for deck substructures, and we're in a period of transition, but it's very important that people understand A, that the change has been made, and B, why it has been made. So Up until sort of end of last year, obviously anything in ground contact was use class 4, but the joist material and associated timbers supporting the deck boards were use class 3. And the background to the change is that we were getting reports of failures through TDCA, but also WPA, and of deck substructures. And clearly, at the risk of stating the obvious, this is safety critical, particularly if the deck is just slightly off the ground. So we reviewed this, our technical committees had a look at it, and then the TDCA, TTF and WPA committees reviewed it, and we decided to change to use class 4. In doing so, we are now consistent with the rest of Europe, and indeed common practice in North America as well. So you could say we were out on a limb before we made this change. So the implication, and these two slides illustrate what, the sort of things that can happen. So the slide on the left, you've got a deck. The deck is flat, but the underlying ground is sloping. So at the near end of that photo, there's plenty of airspace. At the back end of the photo, the joists are actually in ground contact. And then the right-hand photo, obviously there are joists holding that up, but they're clearly in ground contact. But also you can find, with lack of ventilation, vegetation, lack of maintenance, there's 101 reasons why something that looks like it should be well ventilated out of ground contact and not a risk becomes one over time. So that's the logic behind the change to the specification. Next slide, Nick, please. So the communication side of the TTF Action Plan, we've split the workload between TTF and WPA. As Nick will explain a little bit more in a moment, TTF is taking the lead on the builders merchant network, and rightly so. That's where the better contacts and networks are. Whereas WPA has been focusing on fencing and landscaping outdoor applications of treated wood. And in doing that, we've formed partnerships with the British Association of Landscape Industries, BALI, who are a major influencer, COMFOR, as Dave mentioned earlier, and the Association of Professional Landscapers, whose remit is primarily garden landscaping rather than bigger scale, which BALI tends to deal with. So we're doing a lot of work with these groups on allowing them to use our training resources, doing specific training material and education material tailored to their particular membership and end use. And that's going to be rolling over into the next 2 years. So those are very fruitful relationships. But just to say a little bit more about how we're communicating to that sector, Nick, next slide, please. So we've come up, some of you may have seen this, we've come up with a marketing program based on following the ground rules and making sure it's use class 4. So the 3 ground rules in this campaign are specify use class 4, use a trusted treater, and be prepared to pay for the right product. So I just want to unpack each of those a little more. Nick, next slide, please. So we're doing trade advertising and other resources, training and education resources based around these themes. So clearly levels of preservative treatment for ground contact, anything less than use class 4, and service life, safety and customer satisfaction will be compromised. One of the points I'll just throw in here, because it's quite an interesting one, particularly looking at the photograph we've used in that ad, is that it was pointed out to us a couple of weeks ago that the incentives for farmers in particular to use class 4 treated material as opposed to something cheap and cheerful that isn't going to perform were not being helped by the DEFRA specification for agricultural grants, which was very poorly written and really allowed people to apply for grants on the back of using inadequate product. We've since contacted DEFRA, spoken to the right people, and this is going to be changed so that the specification for treated timber required in order for a farmer to get a grant to put up or mend a timber fence will be correct and specify use class 4 to the national standard. Nick, next slide, please. User trusted treater. I'm going to come back a little bit more to what being part of the benchmark scheme means in 2 or 3 minutes. But this obviously links in with the TTF Action Plan. Go to a supplier who is using a treater with third-party accreditation. Obviously, we're talking about use class 4 here, so that's primarily going to be UK treaters, but as we'll see a little later on, for treatment companies or timber suppliers selling treated wood into the UK, then other quality schemes are equally acceptable, like NTR. Next slide, Nick. And yes, in putting all of this together, our WPA's fencing manufacturing members were absolutely clear that we're part of the program needs to be prepared to pay for quality. Let's try and drive out the dual standards within the fencing sector of people who do a really good job and sell a really good product, and people who don't and sell really simply on price. Nick. So yeah, a range of trade advertising, some of it geared to the farming end user as well, very important for the fencing sector, particularly homegrown fencing. Nick, next slide. So the second part of the TTF Action Plan is making sure that people are well informed on how to use treated wood safely and effectively. So we have a series of user notes for the different use classes, and within those we have the sort of do's and don'ts of using treated wood. And the preservative manufacturers all produce very similar literature, which you may or may not already be using. But if you want to use the WPA TTF generic versions, then they're freely available to download. So just to quickly go through some of the key points, establish the use class of the timber before you order it. Make sure that you confirm that in writing. If you're buying something from stock, always check what use class the wood has been treated to. And when cross-cutting, notching, boring, always make sure that the end grain is retreated. Don't substitute wood that's been treated for indoor application for external use. Failure is inevitable. And likewise, don't supply wood that's been treated for external use for what you know will only be internal applications. Thanks, Nick. Next slide. And on top of that, further emphasizing through the make sure it's for marketing program that anything less than use class 4 for ground contact is going to lead to compromised standards. Nick. And yeah, here we have just an illustration of some of the resources available. As Nick said, if you go to the resources page of the WPA website or to the link on the TTF website that he mentioned earlier, all of these are free to download. We just want them used by as many people as possible. All of the information, code of practice is perhaps too detailed for people down the supply chain, but these guidance notes are written specifically to be accessible for everybody. Thank you, Nick. Next one. Yeah, I wanted to say finally a little bit more about the benchmark scheme, clearly in the context of the third part of the TTF Action Plan. The benchmark was first set up in 2011, I think, and is really based on fairly simple principles, and like many quality schemes, if you're running a good operation and the thing is well managed and well supervised, it shouldn't be too difficult for people to gain this accreditation. I'm just going to explain a little bit more of the detail. Nick, next slide. So basically, in order to get benchmark accreditation and to be able to use the benchmark approved treater logo, the operation will be audited. And the evidence that we're looking for is treatment process operating systems, data management. Are things documented? Are the operators trained and competent to carry out the systems that are set down? Is the equipment calibrated, maintained and preservative analysis records kept? That's the solution sample records. Calibration's a big thing. It's easy to assume that the plant is doing what the control system says it's doing. But if you don't calibrate the equipment periodically, then that may not be the case. Need to look at management procedures, how you deal with non-compliant material, things like that. If you're used to ISO 9002, then this is very familiar material to you. Records, internal and third-party system audits as well, if you do those. But lastly, and in a way almost most importantly, the test data to verify that the safe relationship that Nick referred to earlier has been established and maintained. And just to remind you, this is the relationship between the process parameters that the plant is running to and the actual treated wood product that you're selling. Clearly, the treatment plant or the treatment plant operator can't see into each piece of treated wood you're producing. So you have to set up this safe relationship and know that the parameters you're using will produce a product that meets the specification, bearing in mind that the specification is based on the penetration and loading of the preservative. So as part of the audit, we'll require to see safe relationship reports for each of the species groups that you're using, and bear in mind that within each of those groups there may be a number of species, so it may just be permeable and resistant timber species groups, and then the number of use classes that you're using, so maybe 2, maybe 3 use classes that you're treating to. In the early stages, we would require to see that information twice a year, and if everything's going smoothly, that can be reduced to once a year. The number of samples, contrary to some concerns that have been had, are not vast that you need to get analysed. It's all based on statistical principles in accordance with EN standards. I'm not a statistician, I can't even say it, but the number of samples required to get a significant result and in terms of stats isn't enormous. So this needs to be done, but it is not an onerous task. Nick, next slide. If you're already operating a warranty or quality scheme supported by your chemical supply, you should find that 95% of this is already in place. WPA will carry out a verification audit on site. And there is the potential as we move forward, if everything is going really smoothly, everything is fine, there are no non-conformances, and there are plants out there like that, I've audited some myself, then we can periodically do a desktop audit rather than a site audit, which is obviously a cheaper option. But if there is insufficient evidence to facilitate a remote audit, then a site visit will still be necessary. Nick, next slide. Back to you.
That's great, Gordon. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, well, I just wanted to cover in the last few slides some of the information about what the TTF is doing in terms of promoting these new commitments by members and getting the information out to address part B or point B, which is about education. So there's a joint campaign from TTF WPA and TDCA. And as Gordon says, from a TTF perspective, this is concentrating on the merchant part of the business. This campaign kicks off from the 1st of April. And there's a whole number of different strings to our bow in terms of this campaign. So one of the main ones will be about utilising the editorial articles that TTF uses on a regular basis to put information into the merchant media and through into the building sector. We're producing an open out leaflet that's being circulated in the April edition of Professional Builders Merchant. That will be 13,000 copies of that. That's the largest merchant trade publication. This information and leaflet will also be going out through the NMBS in early April. We'll also be utilising the TTF's Good for Wood Business Merchant magazine that goes out to all of the merchant groups, and that'll help us to spread this message. We've also purchased some digital advertising, which appears on a lot of the merchant media in April and May, and this will provide a very obvious link through to pick up the leaflet and the generic information that we're provided. We've already done, Gordon and I have already presented at a BMF members forum, their timber forum on the 26th of February. So we've already started this process, and I'm sure we'll be doing a number of other presentations to a variety of groups. We're then going to push this campaign on out into the general builders sector via media and trade associations, and that will be coming towards the end of April and through into May. And to support members in this campaign, as Gordon said, there's information on the WPA resources page, and the TTF website has its own marketing treated timber page where members can get access to all of the different materials that we're making available, as well as social media materials and a variety of other stuff. And that will be updated, obviously, as the campaign goes along. And then finally, we're making available a WPA TTF training presentation, which, as I said earlier, will be available as a digital download. So you can use that for training your staff and helping to train your customers. So just taking a quick look then at some of the materials that we've got available. So these are the leaflets, the fold-out leaflet, which details the different types of treatment and the different use classes. The leaflet is also available in a copy to which you can add your own contact details and logo. So if you're interested in having your own branded copies of this leaflet or the main leaflet, then please contact the TTF, specifically Camilla, and she'll be able to provide you with the materials to do that. As I said, there will also be quite a lot of social media content available, and the TTF team can help you with that. Both Chris and Camilla will be able to give you details if you get in contact with them. Okay, so that really brings us to the end of our presentation today. Thank you very much to Gordon and to Dave for his introduction.